It was the ultimate taboo. As the Arctic winter buried their hut, the survivors looked at the frozen bodies of their friends not with grief, but with hunger. What the rescuers found on Cemetery Ridge was too horrific to speak of. For 50 years. The wind screams across Cape Sabine. It is a sound that tears at the sanity of the living. Inside the hovel, made of piled stones and an overturned boat, the air is thick with the copper smell of blood and the sour stench of unwashed bodies. It is June 6th, 1884. There is no sun here, only a gray, weeping twilight that bleeds through the cracks in the canvas roof. Sergeant David Brainerd lifts the heavy Remington rifle. The metal burns his skin with cold. His skeletal fingers tremble, not from fear, but from a weakness so profound it feels like his marrow has turned to dust. Across the gloom stands Private Henry. Henry is the strongest of them all. He is the only one who can still walk upright. He is strong because he is a thief. In the pockets of his rags are the stolen strips of sealskin and the last few ounces of shrimp meant for the dying. He chews frantically, swallowing the evidence of his crime. Commander Greely lies on his back in a sleeping bag made of rotting buffalo hide. He cannot stand. He cannot salute. He is a ghost of a leader. He hands Brainerd a scrap of paper, trembling in the draft. It is not a request. It is a death warrant. Shoot him. Greely rasps. The order is absolute. There is no trial. There is no jury. There is only the hunger that has turned civilized men into ghouls. The other survivors watch from their filth. Their eyes are hollow pits reflecting nothing but the instinct to survive another hour. They do not plead for mercy. They know that if Henry lives, they all die. He is eating their lives. Brainerd raises the barrel. The distance is less than 10 feet. Henry turns his face, a mask of shock and defiance. He lunges. The first shot cracks like thunder in a coffin. The bullet strikes Henry, but he does not fall. He is fueled by the stolen energy of his comrades. He roars a sound that is not human. Brainerd cycles the bolt. The metallic click echoes in the sudden silence. The second shot hits the chest. Henry staggers back against the icy stones. The third shot ends it. The strongest man falls. The thief is dead. The echo fades, but the wind outside does not stop. It never stops. Brainerd lowers the gun and looks at the smoking barrel. He wonders if he has just saved them, or if he has damned them all to hell. This is how the record for the Farthest North ends. Not with a cheer, but with an execution. To understand the blood on the rocks of Cape Sabine, we must rewind the clock 3 years. We must go back to a time before the hunger. Back to August, 1881. The story did not begin as a tragedy. It began as a triumph of American will. The steamship Proteus cut through the black waters of Lady Franklin Bay, depositing 25 men on the shores of Ellesmere Island. They were not desperate castaways. They were the tip of the spear of the United States Army. They were strong, well-fed, and armed with the arrogant certainty of the Victorian age. They believed that science and discipline could tame the savage North. They built a fortress against the cold. They named it Fort Conger. It was a palace compared to the hovel where they would eventually die. It was a spacious wooden house insulated with tar paper and double glazing. Inside, the air smelled of pipe tobacco and roasting coffee. They had a library of thousands of books. They had a violin. They had scientific instruments of brass and glass that clicked and whirred in the warmth. The men sat at heavy oak tables playing chess, while the Arctic wind howled impotently outside their walls. They were safe. They were comfortable. They were the masters of their domain. For 2 years, everything went according to the plan. In 1882, they achieved the impossible. 2 members of the party, Lieutenant Lockwood and Sergeant Brainerd, pushed their sledges into the white void and broke the 300-year-old British record for the farthest north. They planted the stars and stripes where no human foot had ever trod. They returned to Fort Conger as heroes. The champagne corks popped. They toasted the President and the Queen. They felt invincible. But the Arctic is a patient hunter. It does not attack when the prey is strong. It waits. The plan relied on a single fragile thread. Every summer, a relief ship was supposed to break through the ice of the Kennedy Channel to bring fresh supplies and news from home. In 1882, the ice did not open. The horizon remained a solid, locked line of white. The men waited, scanning the southern sky for the smoke of a steamer. Nothing came. The sun dipped below the horizon for the long winter night. Summer of 1883 arrived. The ice began to crack and groan. But still, the channel remained choked. August came. The psychological toll of the isolation began to weigh on Commander Greely. He was a man of rigid rules and specific orders. His instructions stated that if no ship arrived by the fall of 1883, he was to abandon Fort Conger and retreat south, to be picked up at the edge of the ice pack. This was the moment, the pivot point between glory and ruin. On August 9th, 1883, Greely gave the order. They would leave the warmth and safety of the wooden fortress. They would leave the library and the extra coal. They would trade the security of land for the chaos of the sea. They loaded their lives into a small steam launch named the Lady Greely and a few open whaleboats. As they pushed away from the shore, they looked back at Fort Conger. The house stood dark and silent against the gray sky. It was a monument to their success, and they were leaving it behind. They motored south into the labyrinth of shifting ice floes. They believed they were sailing toward rescue. They did not know they were sailing directly into the mouth of the trap. The ice pack behind them closed like a steel door. Locking the way back, there was no return. The golden age was over. The descent had begun. The journey south was not a voyage. It was a slow-motion shipwreck. For weeks, the 25 men drifted on a massive pan of ice that spun lazily in the black currents of the Kane Basin. They were castaways on a melting raft. The ice groaned beneath their boots. It cracked in the night, sounding like rifle fire in a cathedral. They dragged their heavy whaleboats over ridges of jagged pressure ridges. They slept in wet sleeping bags that froze as stiff as iron pipes the moment they crawled out. They were moving toward Cape Sabine, because that was the rendezvous point. That was where the ships would be. That was where the food was. Hope was a magnetic north, pulling them toward a bleak promontory of granite. They reached land in October. 1883. They dragged their battered boats onto the shingle of Cape Sabine. They looked out at the water. The bay was empty. There was no smoke on the horizon. There was no ship. There was only the gray heave of the sea and the white teeth of the ice pack closing in for the winter. They found a cairn of stones. A pile of rocks built by human hands is usually a sign of life. But here, it was a tombstone. Inside the cairn was a tin can, and inside the can was a letter. Commander Greely unfolded the paper with fingers numb from the cold. The words were simple and devastating. The rescue ship Proteus had arrived months ago, but the ice had caught it. The hull had been crushed like an eggshell. The ship had sunk on July 23rd, taking with it the winter clothing and the crates of canned beef and the coal. The crew of the Proteus had escaped in their own boats, leaving behind only this note and a few meager caches of hardtack scattered miles across the frozen coast. The silence that followed the reading of the letter was heavier than the glaciers above them. The realization settled on them like a shroud. They were stranded. They were 1,000 miles from civilization, and winter was not coming. It was already here. The sun was setting. It would not rise again for 4 months. The polar night was descending, a long velvet curtain of darkness that would hide their suffering from the world. They had to build a shelter. They had no lumber. They had no tools but a few axes and shovels. They found a depression in the rocks, a hollow place where the wind swirled the snow. They built walls from loose stones, chinking the gaps with moss and gravel that they had to hack from the permafrost. They took their remaining whaleboat and flipped it upside down, placing it on top of the stone walls to serve as a roof. They draped canvas over the boat and piled snow on top of the canvas. They called it Camp Clay. It did not look like a house. It looked like a grave mound. Inside, the ceiling was so low a man could not stand upright. They crawled in on their hands and knees, like animals entering a burrow. The floor was ice-covered with dirty sleeping bags. 25 men were packed into a space meant for 10. When they breathed, the moisture condensed on the cold oars of the boat overhead and dripped back down as icy rain. Then came the mathematics of death. Commander Greely sat in the gloom with a notebook. He inventoried every ounce of food they had dragged from the ice or found in the small caches. He counted the boxes of hardtack. He weighed the cans of pemmican. He looked at the calendar. It was October. The earliest a ship could possibly return was May. That was 7 months away. He did the division. If they ate normal rations, the food would be gone in 30 days. They would all be dead by Christmas. To survive until spring, they would have to exist on a fraction of what a human body needs to function. He set the ration. 14 ounces of food per man, per day. It was starvation by design. It was a slow, unavoidable demise pact. The men looked at the tiny piles of crumbs in their hands. They looked at the dark tunnel of the coming winter. They began to understand that the cold was not the only thing they had to fear. The real horror was the hunger that was already clawing at their bellies. The first blood had not yet been spilled on the snow, but the wound had been opened. The descent had begun. The sun returned in late February. It was a mockery, a cold red eye blinking on the horizon that brought light, but no heat. The light was cruel because it revealed what the darkness had hidden. In the gray illumination of the hut, the men looked at each other and saw monsters. Their hair was matted with soot and grease. Their skin hung on their skulls like wet parchment. Their eyes were huge and glassy, burning with the fever of slow starvation. The food was gone. The hardtack and the pemmican had vanished into the black hole of their hunger. Now, they entered the season of the grotesque. They began to eat things that were never meant to be food. They scraped a black, crusty lichen called rock tripe from the boulders. It tasted like bitter slime and caused violent cramps. But they boiled it into a thick, snotty soup and swallowed it down. They hunted for amphipods, tiny sea lice that swarmed in the cracks of the tide. These creatures were no bigger than a grain of rice. The men called them shrimps, but they were mostly shell and water. A man had to catch 1,000 of them just to get a single mouthful of meat. They spent hours bent over the freezing water, catching lice with frostbitten fingers. When the lice failed, they turned to their gear. They looked at their boots made of sealskin. They looked at the sleeping bags made of buffalo hide. They took knives and sliced the leather into strips. They scraped off the fur and the dirt. They boiled the leather for days, until it turned into a gelatinous, rubbery mass. They chewed on the boots that had walked across the ice. They ate the beds they slept in. The hut smelled of singed hair and boiling glue. The bodies of the men began to revolt. Scurvy arrived not as a disease, but as a disintegration. Their gums turned black and spongy. Teeth became loose and fell out into their hands while they tried to chew the leather. Old wounds from childhood scars that had healed decades ago suddenly tore open and began to bleed afresh. It was as if their bodies were unmaking themselves. The worst horror lived in the corner of the tent. Sergeant Ellison had frozen his hands and feet months ago. He had not died. Instead, he had begun to rot. His feet were black, misshapen lumps of dead tissue attached to living legs. The gangrene spread with a sweet, sickly odor that filled the cramped space. He could not feed himself. He could not clean himself. He lay in his own filth, a helpless infant in the body of a decaying giant. The others, starving and weak, had to lift him and feed him the precious spoonfuls of shrimp stew. He begged for death, but his heart stubbornly refused to stop beating. Then the dying began in earnest. One by one, the men simply ceased to move. A man would be talking about a meal he once ate in New York, and then he would stop mid-sentence and never speak again. The survivors did not have the strength to dig graves in the permafrost. The ground was as hard as iron. They dragged the bodies out of the hut by the ankles. They pulled them up a small ridge known as Cemetery Ridge. They covered the faces with loose gravel and snow. But the wind was a thief. It blew the cover away, leaving a hand or a boot or a frozen face staring up at the sky. The survivors grew fewer. The dead grew more numerous. And in the madness of hunger, a dark thought began to take root in the minds of the living. They looked at the bodies on the ridge. They did not see friends anymore. They saw meat. It was the ultimate taboo, the line that separates man from beast. But hunger erases lines. Whispers filled the dark hut. Knives were sharpened in the shadows. The dead were no longer safe from the living. The descent was complete. They were no longer an expedition. They were a pack. June arrived, not with the promise of warmth, but with the fury of a final executioner. It was midsummer in the rest of the world. In the civilized lands, gardens were blooming and people were walking in parks. But at Cape Sabine, June brought a gale that screamed down from the glaciers with the force of a freight train. The wind did not just blow, it battered. It sought out the weakness in the miserable hovel the men called home. The tent pole, which had held up the center of their canvas roof for 8 months, finally surrendered. It did not snap with a dramatic crack. It simply gave up, sliding sideways in the mud and the slush. The roof came down. The heavy canvas, stiff with ice and weighted with rocks, collapsed directly onto the men lying in their sleeping bags. They were too weak to lift it. They were skeletons wrapped in rags weighing less than 100 pounds each. They pushed up with trembling arms, but the weight of the wet frozen fabric was too much. The roof became a shroud. They were pinned flat against the sharp stones of the floor. For days they lay there, trapped in a space no higher than a coffin. The canvas pressed against their faces, wet and suffocating. They could not sit up. They could not move. They could strictly wait for the cold to stop their hearts. They lay in the semi-darkness, listening to the wind howl. It sounded like the voices of the dead men they had dragged up the hill. They were drinking the dregs of the cup of death. They wrote their final letters in their minds because their fingers were too frozen to hold a pencil. Commander Greely lay in his bag, resigning himself to the end. He had done his duty. He had kept the record. Now, he would die with it. Then came the sound. It was midnight on June 22nd. Through the roar of the gale and the flapping of the ruined tent, Greely heard a noise that did not belong to the Arctic. It was a sharp, mechanical shriek, a whistle, a steam whistle, the sound of coal and iron and industry. He stirred in his bag. He croaked to the others. He told them he had heard a ship. Sergeant Brainerd, the faithful chronicler, shook his head in the gloom. He did not hear it. He told the commander it was the wind blowing over the edge of a tin can. It was the sound of madness. It was the auditory hallucination of a dying brain. They had heard phantom ships before. They had heard bells and voices in the storm. This was just another ghost come to mock them in their final hour. But the sound came again. 3 long blasts. Brainerd forced himself to move. He crawled out from under the collapsed canvas into the blinding twilight of the storm. He dragged his body up the ridge to the lookout point. He scanned the bay. The ice was broken. The water was black and churning. And there, out in the gloom, was a shape, a black hull spewing smoke, a ship. He tried to run, but his legs were useless sticks. He fell. He waved a flag that was nothing more than a dirty rag on a stick. He tried to shout, but his voice was a whisper lost in the wind. Back in the tent, the men heard something new. Not the wind, not the ice. They heard heavy boots running on the rocks, the sound of strong, well-fed men moving with purpose. The footsteps stopped right outside the fallen tent. There was a pause. Then a knife slashed through the canvas roof. The blade ripped the fabric open with a tearing sound that signaled the end of the nightmare. Light flooded into the dark, pungent hole. A face appeared in the opening. It was a face flushed with health and horror. The rescuer looked down into the pit and saw the tangled mass of limbs and rags. He recoiled from the smell of death. He called out, asking who was there. Greely pushed his glasses up his nose with a skeletal hand. He looked up at the light he thought he would never see again. He prepared the final report of the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition. 7 of us, he whispered. 7 of us left here. The collision of 2 worlds happened in an instant. On one side were the men of the United States Navy ships, the Tiz and Bear. They were clean-shaven. Their uniforms were blue and crisp. Their bellies were full of hot coffee and salt pork. On the other side were the creatures of Cape Sabine. They were coated in layers of soot and blubber smoke. Their hair fell to their shoulders in matted, greasy ropes. Their eyes were wild and unblinking. The smell that rolled out of the tent was a physical wall, a mixture of gangrene and excrement and death that made the hardened sailors gag and turn away. The rescuers stepped into the gloom. They saw men who looked like ancient mummies brought to terrifying life. Commander Greely sat amidst the squalor, adjusting his spectacles with a dignity that seemed absurd in the face of such ruin. He tried to rise to greet his saviors, but his legs were useless. He offered a hand that felt like a bundle of dry twigs. 7. That was the number. Out of 25 strong young soldiers who had sailed north with dreams of glory, only 7 remained, and one of them, Sergeant Ellison, was barely tethered to the earth. His body had been so ravaged by frostbite that he would die on the journey home, leaving only 6 to see the harbor lights of New York. The sailors began the delicate work of extraction. They lifted the survivors like porcelain dolls. They carried them out of the darkness of the hut and into the blinding light of the Arctic day. The survivors wept, not from joy, but from the sheer overwhelming shock of kindness. They touched the wool of the sailors' coats as if it were a holy relic. They were fed warm milk and bread, but their shrunken stomachs rebelled. They had forgotten how to eat. But the horror of Cape Sabine had one final secret to surrender. While the survivors were being tended to, the rescue party climbed the small rise known as Cemetery Ridge. They had orders to bring everyone home. No man was to be left behind in the ice. They drove their shovels into the gravel to retrieve the bodies of the 18 dead. The wind whipped around them as they worked. They pulled the shallow graves open. What they found made them stop and look at each other in silence. The bodies were not intact. The flesh had been stripped from the bones, not by wolves, not by bears, but by knives. The cuts were precise. The thighs were stripped. The livers and hearts were missing. The sailors wrapped the remains in canvas quickly. They did not speak of it. They loaded the bodies onto the ships alongside the living. The secret was packed away in the hold, but it hung over the expedition like a poisonous fog. Greely would deny it. The survivors would refuse to speak of it. But the evidence was etched in the bone. They had survived by consuming their brothers. The line of civilization had been erased by the eraser of starvation. The steam engines of the Thetis and the Bear roared to life. Black smoke poured into the pristine white sky. The ships turned their sterns to the rocky promontory and began the long voyage south. Behind them, the stone hovel of Camp Clay stood empty. The wind began to bury it in snow again. The expedition had been a success on paper. They had beaten the British. They had reached the farthest north. They had gathered crates of scientific data on tides and temperatures. But as the coast of Ellesmere Island faded into the mist, the victory felt hollow. The Arctic did not care about their records. It did not care about their flags or their medals. It simply endured. It had taken their flesh and their innocence and given them back nothing but a cold lesson in humility. The ice reclaimed its silence, waiting for the next set of fools to sail north.